Alrighty, well, we're here. I'm here with Levi, and we're talking about the 20th anniversary of the legalization of same-sex marriage in Canada. That was July 20th of 2005, so already 20 years has gone by. Talk a little bit about how we got here, what's transpired over the last 20 years.
Yeah, well, a lot's transpired over the last 20 years. I mean, I started following politics for one, so like that's one big one for me. So like a lot of this, somewhat for me and maybe for you too, is a little bit academic or doing your research or looking through the history books because I certainly wasn't paying attention to politics in 2005 when same-sex marriage has been legalized, and so it sometimes seems like it's been eternity for someone following.
So you don't have any
recently.
recollection of it? Through the courts?
Not really. No.
Okay. So
No.
2005, I would have been in high school somewhere. So I
Yeah.
do have some recollection
Okay.
of, people in church debating it or friends and relatives talking about the
Okay.
fact that it was becoming a thing. But
Yeah, I'm going to not reveal how old I was at that time.
Okay.
But not enough to follow politics at the time.
okay.
But yeah, 20 years ago, it's and it's been quite a long story that it took for same-sex marriage to reach legal status here in Canada. I mean, of course, no major law being overturned or changed or anything like that. It's just boom, something changes. It's just a process of many years, many decisions, many shifts in reasoning. But it kind of really starts, at least the recent impetus before the law that we have today, really started about 2000 or so. And in there was one. It seemed like there was probably just some people who really wanted same-sex marriage to be legalized, and so they pushed the envelope of the law. Because at that time, Canadian law basically said that marriage was between one man and one woman, but then there were some same-sex couples who wanted to get married, and so they went to one minister in Toronto named Brent Hawkes, I believe, and he married them within the official capacity as being a minister of the church. And then they took that marriage certificate from the church and went to the state and said, "State, will you now recognize our marriage as legitimate?" So that really started getting the ball rolling. I mean, there was decades of precedents and conversations and things like that led up to that. But that was really the starting point in the modern legislation that legalized same-sex marriage in Canada.
So prior to that point, obviously, the definition of marriage was sort of a standard thing across, the British Isles.
Mm-hmm.
I know in the article that you wrote, which we'll link in the show notes, it talks about a decision from 1866, right? And that's where you're getting this traditional definition of marriage as people talk about it, right? That he says, marriage as understood in Christendom may for this purpose be defined as a voluntary union for life of one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others. And that also was the same wording, if I understand correctly, in the Canadian version of that as well.
Yeah,
right?
well, there wasn't actually any Canadian statute. And that's kind of one of the cool or funny or strange things about the way that Canada operates, is that when we were formed as a country, some things that we inherited from our British ancestors or Britain, some of them was actually put down into legislation or codification or a constitution or some things like that. And that's what we expect kind of all laws to be like. But until just actually a couple of decades ago, that definition of marriage, that common law definition of marriage, that it's between one man and one woman for life to the exclusion of all, that was just written in a legal case. That was just kind of common law tradition that the Canadian government, the courts, and then the legislature kind of received. So there was no formal definition in a law. It was just the definition that was given in a judge's opinion. Yeah, like you said, back in 1866. So, and actually, the more I get involved in politics and read through history and look in different subjects, the more you see that, where there's actually, like, you could expect there to be a law on whatever it is, be prostitution or the definition of charitable status or what marriage is. But oftentimes just common law traditions developed over long periods of time through the legal system, not legislation that really comes down to brass tacks.
Do you think that results in people sort of having an easier case of trying to overturn a law like that? Because this is just the way things have always been. Nobody's ever actually written it down. This is unfair to a certain segment of the Canadian population. Let's overturn this. Like, that seems to be the argument in the case you were referencing from the early 2000s, right? Do you think there's any merit to that?
Yeah, I suppose it could be if it's not written down formally. Things are always easier to change. But on the other side, it's like that common law definition that had been existed and was a standard for society for hundreds, thousands in biblical cases of years. And so to change such a fundamental definition of what marriage was, even if it wasn't written down in legislation, is also really difficult too. So I don't know if it necessarily helped or hindered in this case, but obviously it went forward.
Mm-hmm. So take us a little bit further along that path then. So 2003, we have an Ontario case. What happens there?
Yeah. So what happened here in Canada, and this is, depending on how you look at it and which issue it is, a blessing or a curse of our style of federalism or style of governance. But what actually happened, so that minister, as we were talking about before, he officiated several same-sex weddings, and they used those new couples, they asked the state to recognize their marriage as legitimate. And of course, because the state couldn't or didn't recognize same-sex unions, they said no. And so that minister and those couples, they challenged the constitutionality of Canada's law, or that common law definition of marriage being between one man and one woman. And so they challenged that in Ontario, and that Ontario court ruled, basically focusing on the equality rights of people who are attracted to the same sex, and say you should be equal, have the equal right to marry someone as someone who is attracted to members of the opposite sex. So they use that constitutional argument that people should be equal or have equal protection in the law to say, no, we have to expand the definition of marriage to include people who are attracted to the same sex. And so that Ontario court struck kind of that common law definition of marriage down in that province. Now, oftentimes what happens when a law is struck down, that court or that government will appeal to a court of appeal or the Supreme Court to try to overturn that decision, and then kind of keep the laws that they pass, or they're in charge of governing or administering, constitutional. But in this case, that didn't happen. So we never got past the Ontario courts into the Supreme Court that would have made that decision apply to all of Canada. So same-sex marriage was first legalized in Ontario, and then similar cases started popping up in other provinces. And within actually just a couple of years, every single province, every single jurisdiction by mid-2005, except for Alberta, Prince Edward Island, and the Northwest Territories had legalized same-sex marriage in their provinces or their territories. So that kind of sets the stage of like it was legal in most of the country except for a couple provinces yet.
So basically what you're saying is that at multiple stages, governments were basically saying, we're not going to get involved in this, almost like you have the court basically saying, we're not going to defend the law on this. We recognize that there's an issue of fairness or equality in the law. You know, their ruling says it was discriminatory even. So they're immediately taking the side of sort of the activists to change the law, right? And then the government at the federal level then, who's actually responsible for the criminal code and for this kind of jurisdiction, they don't even bother to get involved. So you have this weird situation where the provinces are just deciding for themselves what to do, right?
Or at least provincial judges.
Okay.
But actually, it is really interesting because just in the years leading up to the legislation, they eventually legalized same-sex marriage across the country. Parliament themselves, they said, we want to keep the definition of marriage between one man and one woman. So like in 1999, for example, I forget who is the sponsor, the motion here, but they put a motion out, should we keep the definition of marriage as it traditionally is? And the vote was something like... it was relatively overwhelming. Let me see if I can find the numbers. 216 MPs decided let's keep the traditional definition of marriage, and then 55 were opposed. And then go forward a few more years to 2003, and the same motion came up again. Should we keep a traditional definition of marriage? And that it initially was tied 134 to 134, and then they did a recount to fix some technicalities. And it was defeated there as well. But again, just a couple years before same-sex marriage was legalized, Parliament said, no, we're fine with the way traditional marriage is.
Yeah, we're talking 2 years earlier.
Yeah.
So talk through that process a little bit, because I think there's this assumption, you know, even just recently there was a podcast in which it was being stated that, you know, effectively the Conservative Party was the only party that was opposing same-sex marriage. But if I look at the stats you're pointing to, like 1999, 2003, 2005, 2006, those are sort of the significant votes happening in the House of Commons. In each case, you have people from multiple parties actually voting no, right? You've got Liberals in every case. You have a certain group of the Liberals voting against it.
Yeah.
The NDP and Bloc tend to they all fell alongside each other in at least the 2005, 2006 votes. But that tells a bit of an interesting story anyways, in terms of where public opinion was at and where parties were at. Maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it just shows you about how that time it was definitely an issue of conscience, of free votes. Many people, maybe potentially many Catholics who had strong religious views on that, and maybe they gravitated a little bit more towards the Liberal Party. They were going to be staunch in that party and say, no, we don't think that same-sex marriage should be legalized because it violates our personal understanding of marriage, our religious understanding of marriage, and even how that institution is going to play out in society. So yeah, it was really interesting how after those first two votes in 1999 and 2003, should we keep the traditional definition of marriage? Those both passed. And then 2005 was the vote on the Civil Marriage Act, the one that legalized same-sex marriage. That obviously passed. That's why we have same-sex marriage that's legalized today. And then the year after, in 2006, once the Conservatives were starting to get into power, they said, hey, should we go back and try to revisit this issue now that Parliament have shifted? There was a new election. There was fewer Liberals, more Conservatives, different party standings in there. And they did a motion, should we go back and revisit this issue? And unfortunately, that was defeated. And since then, we haven't really had any meaningful debates in any provincial or federal legislatures I'm aware of to whether we should ever revisit this issue.
Mm-hmm. In your article, you talk a little bit about public opinion polling at the time, and you mention sort of this interesting change that happens right when the law was introduced in 2005. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, this is something that you see just on many different political issues. And it kind of just goes back to your theory of what changes or how laws get changed or how they impact public opinion and public morality, public sentiment. Because there's some people who argue what really matters is public opinion. Public opinion in a democracy elects certain people, and those people change the law. So the law follows the public opinion. There's other people that say that, no, actually the law is really important. Like whatever is the law, people are going to gravitate and say, yeah, that's what's good, that's what's or that's wrong, especially in a time when religion and Christianity are declining, that people are increasingly looking to the law to determine what's right and wrong. And on the grand scale of things, it's kind of like a circular feedback loop. Like they both feed into each other. The law feeds back into public opinion, and the public feeds into what the law says. But this is actually a really stark example of how powerful the law can be in shaping public attitudes of what's right and wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's because basically a whole decade before same-sex marriage was legalized in Canada, public opinion was pretty split on the issue. Like it was like 50-50, more or less, or with some people undecided, so that each side was pretty equal. But right after you saw that law passed, there's a divergence started opening up to the point that basically today you have like 70 or 80% of people thinking same-sex marriage is good, it should be legal, it should be allowed, and only about 20, maybe 30% of Canadians say, no, we actually hold to a traditional definition of marriage, and that's what should be Canadian law. So it's one really, really stark example of just how, even within just like 1 or 2 years, like public opinion on this changed drastically simply because the law had.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's indicative too of society in which public opinion becomes the moral legislator of a country, right? Previous to that, I think, or at least we like to think, there was an assumption that there was a moral absolute above the law, or that the law was sort of trying to codify an absolute that already existed outside of just our agreement between each other, right? So I think what we're seeing there, and I think you point that out in your article. We're seeing that shift in culture where people now don't recognize the absolutes. And so the absolute becomes just whatever the government allows. Yeah. I think we've seen that with marijuana legislation. There's been many things in which legalizing something, prostitution, whatever, it suddenly becomes okay to do that for the average person, right?
Yeah, even if it upsets like thousands of years of history. Like we as Christians know from the opening verse of God's word that God created man and woman in his image with the intent that they complement each other. They come together within that covenantal bond of marriage between one man and one woman. So right at the very beginning of creation, God builds into his world, his creational norms, the idea that men and women are the ones to get together, to enjoy the intimacies of marriage, to produce children, to have companionship and help. and for one another. And so that's baked into the very fabric of human existence and human creation. But of course, the fall upsets all of that. So there's all sorts of different temptations for sin, particularly sexual sin, and sexual sin that we see even more and more in our hypersexualized culture today. So it really is an example of something God baking into his original good creation. And over that time, over the course of thousands of years, even though that was the norm for thousands of years, that slowly start to unravel to allow not just no-fault divorce. Canada legalized that in about 1986 or so, and then they legalized same-sex marriage in 2005. And who knows what the next step in that unraveling of a Christian or at the very least, a creational understanding of marriage is.
And I think that's why it's so important from our perspective, and why we actually care about this issue. Because if it was just a matter of personal opinion, and my opinion is this, your opinion's that, you have that religion, I have this religion. Our argument is fundamentally, and you've just laid that out, that this is a creation norm. And that means that it's not just about one religion. It's about this is actually a good for all people, right? And I think that's the fundamental thing, that when we see our society drifting off in a different direction, it's not just, okay, well, that's fine, you guys go do you. But in actuality, it's like, no, this is a concern for our society in general when we go off in this direction.
Yeah.
Maybe you can...
also just goes to show what happens when society gets unmoored from God's foundation and God's intent for marriage and what God's word says about marriage. So, for example, go back to the common law definition of marriage that Lord Penzance said in Hyde v. Woodmansey, that decision from the UK in 1866. He said, "I conceive that marriage, as understood in Christendom," so there's the foundation, there's the basis right there, "may for this purpose be defined as the voluntary union for life of one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others." Well, when no-fault divorce was legalized in Canada, that effectively just shortened that definition a little bit. It just took out that little section for life. And then when same-sex marriage was legalized, it shortened it again. Marriage is defined as a voluntary union of two persons to the exclusion of others. Well, how much further before society collectively says, "Oh, let's shorten the definition even more"? It's discriminatory against people who want to have polygamous marriages, for them not to be able to do that. Let's just shorten the definition of marriage to just between two people and just leave it as a contract like that. That's definitely where we're heading in kind of man reinterpreting and redefining what marriage is, and not being firmly rooted and founded on what God's word and what creational norms say that marriage is.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, this has been a good conversation. Like I say, we'll have the information from the article that you put together in the show notes, and people can read more about how that's all developed over the last 20 years. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Colin.